The sea is vast, cold, and indifferent. Beneath the waves, a deadly silence reigns. But for the men aboard U-123, that silence is both their sanctuary and their prison. It's the night of September 10th, 1943, and the world is at war. In the darkness, far from the reach of the world above, U-123 slices through the deep Atlantic, a ghost beneath the waves. This U-boat, this steel beast, is the pride of the German Navy, fast, deadly, built to strike without warning. A predator, honed by years of relentless training and technology. But even the most formidable hunter can become the hunted. And tonight, U-123 will learn that lesson. Captain Wilhelm Krieger stands on the bridge, his face shadowed by the flickering light from the periscope. The salty sea air stings his skin, but he barely feels it. His thoughts are consumed with the only thing that matters right now: survival. The world is watching, and he knows that this mission, this strike against Allied shipping, could shift the tides of war. "Report, Oberleutnant," he calls out, his voice steady. But even the calmness in his tone can't mask the tension that wraps around his chest like a vice. His first officer, Petty Officer Lehman, looks up from the radar, eyes flicking nervously to Krieger's. "We've detected something, Captain. An Allied convoy, approximately 50 miles west, heading directly into our path." Krieger's mind races. They've been at sea for weeks, waiting, watching. For the past few days, the crew has been on edge, listening for any hint of danger. The silence above them is almost unbearable, but the darkness, the isolation, has become their ally. Every creak of the sub's metal body, every shift of pressure in the water, feels magnified in the depthless blackness. This mission could make or break them. "They don't know we're here," Krieger murmurs, almost to himself. Lehman hesitates before answering. "For now, Captain, but they're moving fast, and the weather's turning bad." Krieger nods. He can feel the weight of the ocean pressing down on him. It's a familiar feeling, but no less daunting. The tension in the crew is palpable, like the taut string of a bow pulled back, ready to snap. The U-boat hums beneath his feet, its engine the only sound breaking the deep silence of the sea. The sonar operator, a young man named Muller, taps his headset nervously. He's been on the crew for almost a year now, but there's a nervousness in his eyes that Krieger can't ignore. "Captain, the convoy's lead ship is coming into range. It's a tanker, loaded with oil, likely heading to Britain," Muller says, his voice thin, almost lost in the hum of the engine. Krieger's heart skips a beat. A tanker, this is their chance. "Prepare the torpedoes," Krieger commands. His voice is low, controlled, as if there is nothing more important than this moment. The crew springs into action, the metal doors clanging shut, the heavy thud of boots moving swiftly across the narrow passageways. The tension is palpable. The clock is ticking, but as the men work, Krieger's mind drifts, not to the torpedoes, nor the convoy, but to the men beneath him. The crew of U-123. These men, his comrades, have become something more than just soldiers. They've become family. They are the heartbeat of this boat, the pulse that keeps them alive in a world that seems bent on their destruction. Lehman moves to stand beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The night is still, too still. Do you think we can do it, Captain?" Lehman asks, his voice quieter than usual. He's been with Krieger since the start of the war, loyal, driven, but even he can feel the weight of this moment. Krieger glances at him, his expression unreadable. "We will do what we've trained for," he replies. His words are firm, but beneath the surface, there's something else, something unspoken, something real. Fear, perhaps, or doubt. He doesn't know. All he knows is that this war, this brutal war, is testing them all in ways they never could have imagined. The convoy is closer now. Krieger feels the pulse of adrenaline surge through his veins as they close the distance. The men are ready, but even they can sense something in the air, the promise of something bigger, something more dangerous. Suddenly, there's a burst of static in the radio room, and the voice of the communications officer crackles to life. "Enemy destroyer, Captain, moving fast. It's a Fletcher class, and it's coming in hot." Krieger's face hardens. The destroyer is a nightmare. Fast, deadly, and equipped with the latest sonar technology. They'll be able to track U-123's every move. This is no longer a simple strike. It's a battle for survival. Lehman's voice is tight with concern. What are your orders, Captain? Krieger doesn't hesitate. Dive. Get us below the surface. Full speed. The sub begins to sink, the pressure building around them. The crew braces themselves, knowing that this dive is their last hope. If they don't outmaneuver the destroyer, if they don't stay hidden beneath the waves, it will be over. In the control room, the air is thick with tension. The hum of the engines grows louder as the boat plunges deeper. Krieger's heart beats in time with the sub's engine. Every man on board is focused, eyes glued to their stations. But there's a growing sense of dread, of inevitability, that seems to hang over them like a shadow. The sonar operator is the first to speak. Destroyer on the surface, closing in. It's too close. They're running out of time. Krieger's mind is a whirlwind. He needs to outmaneuver the destroyer, find a way to escape its radar. The ocean outside feels more like a trap than a refuge. His hand grips the controls tighter, the strain of command heavy on his shoulders. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, he says, his voice as calm as he can make it. And load all remaining torpedoes. We're not running from this fight. The crew moves quickly, and in the eerie quiet of the sub, there's a palpable sense of finality. This is it. The ocean outside is dark and vast, but it feels smaller now, like a coffin waiting to seal them in. The destroyer is getting closer, and with it, the promise of death. Krieger stares ahead, his eyes narrowed in focus. He's not afraid, not really, but he knows the odds. This is a gamble, a game of survival, a battle against the forces that want to sink them. But deep down, there's a quiet certainty that rises in his chest. If they go down, they will go down fighting. Lehman stands at his side, watching the radar screen, his eyes flicking between it and Krieger's steely face. The destroyer is almost on top of us. Captain, I know, Krieger replies, his voice a whisper now. But we will not give up. Not while there's breath in our lungs. Not while there's still fight in our hearts. As U-123 descends deeper into the abyss, the world above them fades into an eerie silence. The men aboard this boat have faced countless challenges, but none like this. The odds are stacked against them, but still, they hold on to hope. Not because they expect to win, but because in the depths of the ocean, where no one can hear them scream, they choose to fight. The convoy is just ahead, but so is their enemy. The battle has begun, and there's no turning back. The first strike will decide everything. The sea is a fickle companion. One moment, it cradles you in its silent embrace, and the next, it swallows you whole. For U-123, the moment of calm was over. The storm had arrived. Only, it wasn't one born of wind and rain. It was a storm of metal, fire, and fury. The enemy was closing in. Inside the U-boat, the air had thickened. The familiar hum of the engines, which usually felt like a comforting heartbeat beneath their feet, now felt like a ticking bomb, counting down to something inevitable. The men aboard U-123 moved with grim purpose, their faces drawn, their bodies tense, aware that this night would either make them heroes or ghosts in the depths of the Atlantic. Captain Wilhelm Krieger stood in the control room, hands steady on the periscope. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were narrowed against the dark sea outside, where shadows danced with deadly intent. Above them, the convoy was there, somewhere, but it was the destroyer that haunted his thoughts. "We're at the edge," Krieger muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Lehman, his first officer, to hear. "We're not just out here to sink ships anymore. We're fighting for our lives." Lehman didn't need to ask what Krieger meant. He'd seen the desperation in his captain's eyes. A Fletcher-class destroyer had found them. Its presence on the radar wasn't just a blip. It was the harbinger of their doom. In the silent moments that followed, a sense of dread hung thick in the air. The crew had felt it ever since the sonar operator had given them the report. A destroyer on their tail, closing fast, with no room to maneuver. The clock was ticking. "Captain, it's coming," Muller, the sonar operator, said in a strained voice, his eyes glued to the screen. He was a young man, barely older than 18, but the war had aged him beyond his years. His hands trembled as he adjusted the controls. Krieger's gaze flicked to the radar. The shape of the enemy destroyer loomed large, a dark shadow on the horizon. It was moving fast, too fast. No one spoke, but the tension was a shared thing between them all. They knew the stakes. They knew the consequences. Krieger turned to the torpedo officer, his voice low but urgent. "Torpedoes ready?" The officer nodded, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Ready, sir." The captain's jaw tightened. "Fire when ready." A sharp, mechanical sound filled the control room as the first torpedo launched. The world outside, the vast expanse of the Atlantic, seemed to pause in that moment. The U-boat's crew held their breath as the torpedo sliced through the water, its wake barely visible in the dark sea. But the destroyer wasn't going to give them the luxury of time. The first explosion had barely died down when the next came. The boom of depth charges as the destroyer unleashed its first salvo. The force of it rattled through the U-123 like a sledgehammer, the hull groaning in protest. "Hold steady," Krieger barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "Steady, goddammit." But the sub was anything but steady. The force of the depth charges sent shudders of pain through the boat, and every man aboard could feel the pressure bearing down on them like a weight. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the smell of oil and fear. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. For a brief moment, the world inside U-123 was nothing but chaos. A dark, pulsating heart, pumping adrenaline and dread through their veins. Krieger's eyes darted to the sonar readout. The destroyer had come within striking distance. "We need to get deeper," he muttered, though he knew it was a losing battle. The enemy had the advantage: speed, precision, and the advantage of being on the surface, where they could track every move. As the second depth charge hit, the sub's frame rattled again, this time more violently. The sound of twisting metal filled the air, the groan of steel straining under the weight of the ocean's pressure. Below decks, the crew felt it in their bones. The U-boat was wounded, but the fight wasn't over. "Torpedo tube 2, fire," Krieger ordered. His voice, usually calm and measured, was tight with urgency now. The next torpedo streaked into the water with a hiss, the cold Atlantic swallowing it whole. "Captain, it's not enough," Lehman said, his voice low. "We're outnumbered. We're outgunned. We fight," Krieger interrupted, his voice hard as iron. "We fight until we can't. That's the only option we have left." The world outside was an inferno now. The destroyer was circling, its depth charges falling in rapid succession. Each explosion felt like a knife to the heart of U-123. The boat groaned, the air thick with the smell of burning fuel, the sound of pressure building, pressing, suffocating. Krieger's face was drawn, his brow slick with sweat. His thoughts raced as he looked through the periscope again. The convoy, where was it? The destroyer's relentless assault on their position had driven them deeper, closer to the ocean's crushing embrace, but it had also separated them from their target. "Report," Krieger said sharply, never taking his eyes from the periscope. Muller's voice was a shaky whisper. "The convoy's moving out of range, Captain. It's dispersing, probably to avoid us." "Damn it," Krieger muttered. They had come so close. And now the convoy, their only chance for survival, was slipping away. The destroyer had made sure of that. The hunt was on, but the prey was no longer within their grasp. "Should we turn back?" Lehman asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Should we run?" Krieger's gaze hardened, his hand gripping the controls tighter. "We don't run. We fight." It wasn't just pride that made him say those words. It was something deeper, something that ran through the veins of every man aboard U-123. The need to survive, the need to fight back against the odds. In the depths of the Atlantic, with death hovering over them like a specter, this was all they had left. "Set course for the convoy," Krieger ordered, his voice unwavering. "We may not be able to sink them, but we can still make them remember us." The crew moved quickly, adjusting their course, preparing for whatever came next. The depth charges continued to rain down, each one rattling the hull, each one a reminder of the brutal reality they faced. But through it all, U-123 remained steady. The men aboard her were battered, bruised, and bloodied, but they were still alive. And as long as they were alive, they would fight. Minutes stretched into hours. The convoy was no longer visible, but Krieger knew it was out there, somewhere, just beyond the reach of their torpedoes. They were still in the game, but every moment was a gamble. Every decision could be their last. The pressure outside was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the pressure inside. The crushing weight of knowing that the enemy was just above them, closing in, and that escape was slipping further and further away. Another depth charge exploded, this one closer than the rest. The sound reverberated through the U-boat's steel frame, like the roar of a beast hunting in the dark. The pressure was immense, the boat buckling under the strain. Yet Krieger stood firm, his eyes fixed ahead. The only thing that mattered now was survival. "Prepare for another strike," Krieger said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. The crew nodded, a synchronized effort born of trust, born of the shared understanding that they would go down fighting, if it came to that. Every man on board knew what it meant to be in these depths, to be trapped like this. But there was one thing they all shared: an unshakable will to survive. For in the end, the deep waters of the Atlantic were not just a place of death. They were a place of defiance. And U-123 would fight until the last breath beneath the black waves. The ocean is a place of paradoxes, both a cradle and a tomb. It can be your protector, hiding you from the world above, or it can turn on you in an instant, crushing everything in its path. For U-123, the surface was no longer their refuge. The endless black waters had become a maze, a place where danger waited in every shadow. Beneath the waves, silence reigned, but it was the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against the chest with the force of 1,000 unseen threats. Inside the U-boat, the mood had shifted. There was no longer the sharp, frantic energy of battle, only the eerie calm that followed after the storm. The depth charges had stopped, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. The destroyer had retreated, but it hadn't given up the hunt. Krieger knew that the moment they surfaced, the enemy would be there, waiting. The game had changed. Now, they were the prey. Captain Wilhelm Krieger stood in the control room, his eyes fixed on the sonar screen. The steady beeping of the radar was like the ticking of a clock, each pulse bringing them closer to something they couldn't escape. Every crew member was at his station, focused, but there was no denying the tension. It was the quiet before the storm, a silence that pressed in on them, heavier than the water outside. "They're still out there," Lehman, the first officer, said quietly, as if stating the obvious. His voice was hoarse, worn from hours of constant stress. "The destroyer's not gone. It's circling, waiting for us to make a move." Krieger nodded, not bothering to respond. He didn't need to speak to convey the weight of the situation. They were stuck, trapped in a silent battle with an enemy they couldn't see, but one that could destroy them with a single strike. Down in the bowels of the boat, the crew was doing what they could to prepare. The torpedoes were loaded and ready, but there was no guarantee they would even get a chance to fire them. The ocean outside felt like a living thing, pressing in from all sides. The U-123 was a fragile steel shell, hurtling through the deep, and the cold, suffocating water was closing in around them. "Captain," said Muller, the sonar operator, his voice cracking. He had been on edge for hours, ever since they had first detected the destroyer. His eyes darted to the screen, his face pale. "The destroyer's still in range. It's moving fast, but something's off." Krieger looked at the radar, his expression unreadable. The destroyer's signal was clear, its pulse unmistakable. But there was something strange about its movement. It wasn't just patrolling, it was circling them, trying to anticipate their every move. "I think they're testing us," Lehman said, his voice tight, "seeing if we'll break. They're trying to provoke us into revealing ourselves." Krieger's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him like a vice. To surface now was to expose themselves, to throw themselves back into the storm. But to stay submerged, to wait, was to allow the destroyer to gain ground, to outmaneuver them and force them into a corner where they wouldn't have any choice but to fight. "They know we're here," Krieger said, his voice low but steady. "We can't hide forever." There was a pause, a moment where time seemed to stretch, the seconds dragging on like hours. Krieger didn't have the luxury of indecision. The mission had already been compromised. They had no choice but to act. "Prepare to surface," he said finally, his voice firm. "We're going to make a break for it." The crew sprang into action, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The hatches were secured, the ballast adjusted, and the engine room roared to life. The boat began its slow ascent toward the surface, rising from the depths like a sleeping giant awakening from its slumber. Every man aboard knew the risk, but they didn't hesitate. This was war, and they would meet it head-on. As the U-123 neared the surface, the air inside the boat seemed to thicken. Every breath felt heavy, like it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Krieger stood at the controls, his eyes fixed ahead, but even he couldn't ignore the tension that gripped his chest. He could feel the presence of the destroyer, its radars searching for them, its weapons primed and ready. "Stand by," Krieger muttered under his breath. "When we surface, we'll give them everything we've got." The boat broke through the water with a sudden lurch, the hull groaning as it rose into the open sea. The wind hit them like a slap, the salty spray stinging their faces, but it was the sight that struck them hardest. The destroyer, just off the starboard side, silhouetted against the gray sky. The beast was there, its guns trained, its radar spinning, its crew waiting for the first sign of weakness. For a moment, everything stood still. Time seemed to pause, and in that moment of suspended animation, Krieger made a decision. There would be no retreat, no running. They would fight. "Fire the torpedoes," he commanded, his voice a calm contrast to the chaos building around them. The torpedo officer, hands trembling but determined, loaded the weapons into the launch tubes. The sound of the torpedo doors opening was deafening in the silence that had filled the room. The crew braced themselves. It wasn't just about hitting the enemy now. It was about showing them that U-123 was not going to go quietly into the dark. The first torpedo shot out of the tube, disappearing into the depths with a soft hiss. The crew waited, holding their breath, as if the very air had frozen around them. And then, the world exploded. The destroyer erupted in a ball of fire and smoke, the explosion lighting up the horizon as it shook the sea beneath them. A thunderous roar filled the air, deafening in its intensity, as the shockwave rippled across the surface of the ocean. The crew of U-123 let out a collective gasp, their hearts pounding in their chests. But even as the destroyer burned, there was no time for celebration. The sea was still alive with the sound of gunfire, and the second destroyer was closing in. It had heard the explosion. It was coming for them. The first strike had landed, but the war was far from over. "Prepare to dive," Krieger ordered, his voice steady. But beneath it, there was a trace of something more, something primal. A flicker of fear. "We've only got one shot at this." The boat groaned as it began its descent, the water pulling it back into the deep. Krieger's hand gripped the controls tighter, his knuckles white. The pressure was building, but there was no room to escape. The destroyer was relentless, and they were running out of time. Below deck, the crew was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts, each heart racing in the dark. The only sound was the pounding of the U-123's engines, their growl echoing through the boat like a living creature. It was a sound that both comforted and terrified them all. They were alive for now, but how much longer could they hold on? For Krieger, there was no time to think of anything beyond the next move. They had come so close to victory. But the enemy was still out there, circling, waiting. They had to strike again. "Fire torpedo tube 3. Krieger barked, the words coming out with a force that surprised even him. It wasn't just a command. It was a promise. Another torpedo launched, streaking through the water, and the tension in the air thickened. The crew held their breath, every man wishing for a miracle. But as the torpedo left the U-123, a new sound echoed through the boat. The sound of enemy sonar. The destroyer had locked onto them again. "We're running out of time," Lehman said quietly, his voice tinged with the weight of reality. Krieger's gaze hardened. "Then we'll make them remember us." As the second torpedo disappeared into the deep, the crew of U-123 prepared for whatever came next. They had no illusions about the odds. They knew what the enemy could do. But they were alive, and as long as they breathed, they would fight. The battle was far from over. The U-123 had taken its first blow, but it would not go down easily. The crew was ready. And the destroyers? They were about to learn what it meant to face the hunter that had become the hunted. The ocean's surface was calm once again, but the storm brewing beneath it was just beginning. The crew of U-123 had fired their shot, but the real fight was still to come. The sea is a cruel master. It gives life, but it can also take it with a single whisper of the wind, a single shift in the current. The ocean had swallowed U-123 whole, and as it descended deeper into the abyss, the men aboard her felt it, not just in their bones, but in their very souls. The world above had vanished, leaving them in a vacuum of cold, dark water. But it wasn't the darkness that gripped them. It was the crushing weight of their own choices. The world above had known their names for a brief moment. Their torpedoes had struck true, but now they were lost in the vast, indifferent depths of the Atlantic. 123 was no longer the predator, stalking its prey in the shadows. It had become the hunted, a wounded animal scrambling for survival in a world that seemed bent on crushing it. The crew could feel it, the sense of inevitable doom creeping closer with each passing moment. But there was still a fire in them, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. As long as they breathed, as long as their hands could grip the controls, they would not surrender. Not to the sea, not to the destroyers that pursued them. Inside the U-boat, the atmosphere had shifted from the chaos of battle to something quieter, more oppressive. The sound of the engines, once a comforting hum, was now a reminder of how fragile their existence truly was. Every slight vibration of the hull felt like a threat, a warning from the deep. The crew moved more slowly now, every step measured, as if the boat itself might collapse under the weight of its own failure. Krieger stood in the control room, his face drawn tight with concentration. He had always prided himself on his ability to lead in the face of danger, but this was something different. The attack had been fierce, and though they had struck a blow against the destroyer, they had paid a heavy price. The U-boat was damaged, and every minute they stayed submerged was a risk. The pressure was growing, and the men knew it. It wasn't just the water that threatened to crush them. It was the isolation, the endless stretch of dark water that pressed in from all sides, pushing them deeper into the abyss. "Captain," Lehman said, his voice breaking the stillness. He had been standing beside Krieger, watching the sonar readout. "The destroyers are still up there. They haven't stopped searching for us. I don't know how much longer we can stay down here." Krieger didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. They couldn't stay down forever. The U-boat was still intact, but they had taken damage. The hull was weaker than it had been before, the pressure of the ocean closing in from all sides. They had survived the first round, but they were running out of time. "We go deeper," Krieger said finally, his voice a low growl. "We go as deep as we can. The deeper we go, the harder it is for them to track us." Lehman didn't argue. He nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But even he could feel the strain in Krieger's voice. The captain was a man who prided himself on control, on knowing the battlefield. But now, in the suffocating silence of the ocean, even he didn't know what to expect. The U-boat groaned as it descended further into the depths. The crew could feel the pressure mounting, each meter pulling them deeper into the dark heart of the sea. The lights flickered briefly as the engines worked harder to power the vessel deeper. The familiar hum of the machinery was now drowned out by the feeling of impending doom. The sense of weight, both physical and emotional, pressed on their chests, a constant reminder that they were teetering on the edge of oblivion. Down in the control room, the tension was palpable. Muller, the sonar operator, stared at the screen, his eyes darting between the readouts, his face tense. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the occasional ping of the sonar and the groaning of the submarine's hull. Outside, the destroyers were still there, hovering just above the surface, searching. But the deeper they went, the further they moved away from detection. The men knew that the depth was their ally, but it was also their enemy. Every second they spent in the depths was a second closer to running out of air, to running out of time. The pressure of the ocean was a living, breathing thing, and it wasn't something the men could ignore. Krieger watched Muller's face as the sonar screen flickered. He could see the worry in the young man's eyes. "What is it, Muller?" Muller hesitated, then looked up, his voice strained. "It's the depth charges, Captain. They're getting closer. They know we're down here. They're dropping them in patterns, trying to flush us out." Krieger's gaze hardened. He knew what that meant. The enemy had switched tactics. They had gone from hunting to an all-out assault, trying to force them to the surface where they could be finished off. The destroyers weren't going to let up until they were certain U-123 was at the bottom of the sea, where it could never rise again. "Prepare the forward ballast tanks," Krieger ordered. "We're going to level off at 200 meters. Lehman stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "Captain, 200 meters? That's pushing it. We're already taking damage. If we go that deep, we might not come back." Krieger's eyes never left the sonar screen. "We don't have a choice. At this depth, they won't be able to track us with their sonar. We'll go as deep as we can. We'll hold steady. If they can't find us, they can't kill us." There was a brief silence in the room, a moment of collective understanding. The men knew the stakes. They had been pushed to the edge, and now there was no turning back. They would either sink into the abyss, lost to the deep, or they would survive, against all odds. The U-boat shuddered as the ballast tanks released, sending the vessel deeper into the ocean's embrace. Every creak of the hull was amplified in the quiet of the control room. The sound of the sea outside, muffled by the thick walls of steel, became a constant reminder of their vulnerability. But there was no turning back now. The deeper they went, the less likely they were to survive. But staying above, exposed to the deadly assault from the destroyers, was no longer an option. They had to go down, deeper than they had ever gone before. As the U-123 leveled off at 200 meters, the pressure was suffocating. The crew could feel it in their chests, in their bones. The weight of the ocean above them was a constant pressure, grinding them down. It was as if the sea itself were trying to swallow them whole. But they fought against it. They had no choice. Krieger stood in front of the control panel, his hands steady on the levers, his mind focused. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the occasional ping of the sonar. They had left the surface behind, but in this darkness, in this crushing abyss, there was no certainty. There was only the next breath, the next second, the next decision. "We're holding steady," Lehman said, his voice tight but relieved. Krieger nodded, though he didn't feel any relief. Not yet. The destroyers were still up there, waiting, and now they had no choice but to wait, too. Outside, the ocean pressed in on them, unforgiving, cold, and dark. There was no escape, but Krieger knew this. He knew that as long as they had breath in their lungs, they had a chance. It wasn't much of a chance, but it was a chance. And as the hours dragged on, the U-123 remained deep, its crew locked in a battle not just for survival, but for something more, for the right to say, against all odds, that they had fought until the very end. In the deep, dark ocean, there is no room for doubt. There is only the will to survive. And for the men of U-123, that was all they had left. The deeper you go, the farther you get from the world you know. Below the surface, there is no light, no sound. Only the crushing pressure of the water, the unrelenting weight of the ocean pushing down on you from every direction. For U-123, it wasn't just the pressure of the sea that threatened to collapse them. It was the pressure of time, of being trapped beneath the waves, hunted by an unseen enemy. The deep was supposed to offer them refuge, a place to hide, but it also had a way of pulling you in, swallowing you whole. The air inside the boat was thick, suffocating almost. The men, long past exhaustion, sat in their stations, barely moving, eyes locked on the various gauges and readouts that monitored their slow descent into the abyss. They hadn't spoken much since they'd submerged hours ago. The sound of the engines was the only thing that cut through the quiet, the occasional ping of the sonar reminding them that even down here, the world above hadn't forgotten them. Krieger stood at the helm, his hand resting lightly on the controls. His eyes were fixed on the sonar, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere far from the boat, far from the battle they had fought and the one that still loomed over them. He hadn't allowed himself the luxury of doubt, not until now. It was strange how the sea could turn your thoughts inward. In the claustrophobic silence, it felt as though every man aboard had disappeared, leaving only the weight of the boat and the ocean pressing down from above. He had been in the Navy for years. He had seen battles. He had seen men die in the name of a cause. But nothing compared to the gnawing feeling of being hunted in the depths, knowing that above you, a predator circled, waiting for you to make the wrong move. They were out of range for now, but they wouldn't stop. The destroyers were still up there, still searching for them, still trying to find any sign, any slip-up that could reveal their position. Every heartbeat was another moment closer to the inevitable. The sonar pinged again, louder this time, and Krieger's eyes snapped back to the screen. He didn't need to look at his crew to know that they were all listening intently. The enemy was still up there, just above the surface, circling like sharks in the dark. "They're closing in," Muller, the sonar operator, said, his voice thin, barely audible over the sound of the humming engine. "I'm hearing sonar pings, and they're getting closer." Krieger nodded, his expression unreadable. It was a game of cat and mouse. The deeper they went, the more difficult it was for the enemy to track them, but the longer they stayed submerged, the closer the risk of running out of air became. The pressure outside was intense, but it was nothing compared to the pressure inside the boat. Every man aboard was aware of it, the suffocating feeling that they had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The destroyers above them were relentless, and the silence, that oppressive, crushing silence, was louder than any explosion. "We can't stay here much longer," Layman, the first officer, said quietly from across the room. He hadn't taken his eyes off the sonar, either, but Krieger could see the exhaustion in his face. They were all feeling it now, the slow drag of time, the fear that the longer they stayed submerged, the more the ocean would take from them. "We stay as deep as we can," Krieger replied, his voice steady. But the weight of the decision hung in the air. "We wait for them to pass. We wait until they give up the search." And so they did. Hours passed in that dark, suffocating silence. Every man aboard U-123 had their own thoughts, their own demons to wrestle with. Muller could feel the strain in his chest as he listened to the sonar. He had never been this far down, never spent so long submerged, so far from the surface. Each ping of the radar felt like a jolt of electricity, a reminder of how close they were to being found. Krieger's mind was elsewhere, but his focus never wavered. He had to think, he had to lead. If they were going to survive, they needed to be one step ahead of the enemy. They needed to remain invisible, to remain unpredictable. But as the hours passed, the darkness outside seemed to creep into the boat itself. The tension inside U-123 was palpable, thick, and suffocating. The crew had become a machine, but it was a machine that was starting to slow down, its gears grinding against the overwhelming weight of fear. Every man aboard had heard the rumors, stories whispered between missions, tales of boats that had gone down and never returned, U-boats that had been caught in the depths, trapped between the enemy above and the ocean below. The thought gnawed at them, just beneath the surface of their resolve. And then, in the midst of the oppressive silence, the quiet, grinding sound of the boat's engine began to falter. A soft cough, a stutter, and the vibrations under their feet faded. Krieger's heart skipped a beat. "What's happening?" he demanded, turning to his engineers. One of the men, his face drawn, looked back up at him. "Engine trouble, sir. We've lost power in the starboard side." For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air in the room thickened, each breath harder to take. The enemy was still up there, still circling. And now, their engine was failing. "How bad?" Krieger asked, his voice tight. "Not sure, sir," the engineer replied, looking down at the controls. "Could be the pressure. Could be damage from the last round of depth charges. But if it's not fixed, we won't be able to stay submerged." Krieger turned away from him, his mind racing. He couldn't let them know how close they were to breaking. They had to keep their resolve, no matter what. But deep down, he knew the truth. The longer they stayed under, the greater the risk. The pressure would tear them apart. They had no choice now but to try and fix it, or face the unimaginable, coming up to the surface where the destroyers would be waiting. He stared at the controls, willing himself to think clearly. "We need to fix it now," he said, his voice hard. "Layman, take a team and get down to the engine room. I'll hold the course." Layman nodded, his expression grim, and immediately turned to gather the crew to fix the damage. The boat was wounded, but they had no choice but to try and repair it. They couldn't afford to surface. As Layman disappeared into the depths of the boat, Krieger remained at the controls, eyes flicking over the sonar. The ping of the destroyer above was still there, still closing in. Every moment felt like an eternity, every second a countdown to their fate. The crew worked quickly, but time was slipping through their fingers. Down in the bowels of the submarine, the air was thick with the sound of men working in the dark. Wrenches clanged against metal, voices echoed in the cramped space. The smell of oil and burning wires mixed with the stale air, a constant reminder that they were fighting for their lives. Layman worked alongside the crew, trying to repair the engine as quickly as possible. But with every second that passed, the weight of the situation pressed harder on them all. They were running out of time. The destroyers were still there, and they were getting closer. Back in the control room, Krieger couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. His mind raced, but there was nothing he could do but wait. He had never felt so helpless. The deep silence outside was deafening now, the ocean pressing in on them, as if it was trying to drag them under. It was a battle against time, against the unforgiving nature of the sea. And then, a sound, a soft mechanical whine, a flicker of hope. "It's fixed, Captain," Layman said over the intercom, his voice rough, but relieved. We've got power again. Krieger let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The relief was fleeting, though, because the reality of their situation hadn't changed. They were still deep in the ocean, still hunted by the destroyers above. And now, they had to make a decision. Steady on, Krieger ordered, his voice calm once more. We moved slowly. We stayed deep. The boat's engines hummed to life again, and U-123 began to creep forward, moving deeper into the ocean's heart. The pressure was immense, but it was the only place left for them to go. They were still alive, still holding on, but they knew that every moment could be their last. And in the cold, suffocating embrace of the deep, survival was no longer a certainty. It was a battle, and it would be a battle they would fight until the very end. In the dark, with the ocean pressing down on them from all sides, the men of U-123 could only hold their breath and wait. But as long as they still had air in their lungs, as long as the engines kept running, they would fight. They had no other choice. The sea is an unpredictable thing. It can be both your ally and your enemy, a cruel mistress that shows no mercy. For U-123, it had been a sanctuary, a place to hide from the unrelenting enemy above. But the deeper they went, the more the ocean itself began to feel like a trap. Every creak of the hull, every groan of steel against the crushing pressure, was a reminder that they were no longer masters of their fate. The ocean was, and it would take what it wanted. Inside the U-boat, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The men had grown quiet, their voices few, but their minds working furiously. The hours had stretched into days, the weight of isolation bearing down on them, thickening the air with something far heavier than the water outside. There were no simple solutions, no quick fixes. They had reached the point of no return. And yet, as the hours passed, there was something else that began to seep into the quiet, the gnawing feeling of something shifting, something changing. Krieger stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the sonar screen, his mind a battlefield of its own. The destroyers were still above, still hunting them, but now, the ping of their sonar was becoming sporadic, more erratic. They had been circling for days, never leaving, as though they sensed something was different. We've evaded them for now, Krieger muttered to no one in particular, his voice a strained whisper. But we can't keep this up forever. Lehman, his first officer, was standing beside him, looking at the same sonar readout. His face was gaunt, dark circles beneath his eyes from lack of sleep. They're getting restless, Captain. They know we're down here, and they're closing in. But something's off. I've never seen them behave like this before. Krieger didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what Lehman meant. The destroyers were losing their patience. Their search patterns were changing. They had been circling methodically, but now they were becoming erratic, desperate. They were searching every possible angle, trying to flush U-123 from the depths. It wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was a countdown. Krieger turned away from the sonar and made his way toward the control panel. The crew had done their best to keep the boat steady, to keep it hidden in the deep. But even here, in the darkest recesses of the ocean, there were no guarantees. The pressure of the sea outside was immense, and every moment they stayed submerged brought them closer to collapse. The U-boat was not indestructible, and the deeper they went, the closer they came to reaching the limit of what the vessel could endure. Time is against us, Krieger muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He was thinking of the men aboard, of the suffering they had endured, and of what might come next. Lehman, sensing the shift in Krieger's thoughts, placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll make it through this, Captain. We always do. Krieger met his gaze, his expression unreadable. You're right, but for how much longer? The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken fears. The question was simple, but the answer was not. How long could they survive down here, with the enemy above, closing in? How much longer could they hold out before the ocean, or the enemy, or the very limits of their resolve tore them apart? Below deck, the rest of the crew was trying to carry on as best they could. They were used to being in close quarters, but even the most seasoned sailors felt the strain now. The lack of sleep, the pressure, the unrelenting weight of knowing they were being hunted. Everything weighed on them, leaving them brittle, their nerves fraying at the edges. Muller, the sonar operator, had been at his station for what felt like days. His eyes never left the screen, his mind locked in a constant, swirling dance of calculations and fear. Every ping of sonar was a potential threat. Every silence between pings was a potential escape. But the silence was rare, and the pings were getting closer. Captain Muller's voice broke through the quiet, his tone thin and shaky. They're closer now. I think they've spotted something. Krieger's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his chest. He knew what this meant. The destroyers had found something. Maybe it was them. Maybe it wasn't. But it didn't matter. They would not stop. They would not let go. Can we move? Krieger asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Muller shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with fear. We can't outrun them. They're closing in too fast. They're using their sonar to track us. Krieger's eyes narrowed. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that they couldn't stay hidden forever. But he hadn't expected it to feel so inevitable. He turned to Layman. Prepare the men. Get the torpedoes ready. If we're going down fighting. Layman nodded, his expression grim, and moved swiftly to organize the crew. The weight of the order hung heavily in the air. There was no turning back now. U-123 had been a hunter, a shadow in the deep. But now, with their cover blown, they would fight to the last. Inside the torpedo room, the crew worked quickly. The men were tense, their hands shaking slightly as they loaded the torpedoes into the launch tubes. The sound of metal on metal echoed through the boat, a reminder of the battle that was about to unfold. Outside, the destroyers were closing in, their sonar pings growing louder with each passing second. The ocean outside was vast, an endless expanse of darkness, but it felt smaller now. Every moment brought them closer to the enemy, closer to the inevitable confrontation. Krieger stood in the control room, his hand gripping the periscope. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing on him. The lives of the men aboard U-123 resting in his hands. The enemy was out there, and there was only one way to fight back. Full speed ahead, he ordered, his voice steady, though the tension in his chest was like a vice. Prepare for the attack. The boat surged forward, its engines humming as it cut through the cold water. The men aboard moved quickly, focused, knowing that the time had come. There was no more hiding. There was no more waiting. They would face the enemy head-on. The first destroyer broke through the surface, its silhouette cutting a dark figure against the horizon. The crew of U-123 held their breath. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. They were about to fight not just for survival, but for something more, for their pride, for the lives of the men beside them. Fire! Krieger barked. The first torpedo streaked through the water, a flash of steel in the dark. It flew toward the enemy destroyer with deadly precision, cutting through the waves like a harbinger of death. And then, the explosion. The destroyer rocked violently, a blast of light and fire erupting from its hull. The shockwave reverberated through the water, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. The crew of U-123 held their breath, waiting to see if the hit had been enough, if the destroyer was gone. But the silence didn't last. The second destroyer was still out there, and it wasn't going to stop. It was coming for them now, its guns trained, its crew ready to retaliate. Brace for impact, Layman shouted as the second destroyer closed in, its depth charges falling like rain from the sky. The boat shuddered with the first explosion, the force of the blast rattling through the U-123 like a giant's fist pounding against the steel. Inside the control room, the walls seemed to close in. The pressure was mounting from every direction. Outside, the ocean, and inside, the fear. The fear that the next explosion might be their last. But Krieger didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. Fire the second torpedo, he ordered, his voice unwavering. The second torpedo launched, streaking through the water. It was a final shot, a last chance. U-123 had no more moves left. No more tricks. It was all or nothing. And then, the world exploded. The ocean was torn apart as the second torpedo hit, sending the destroyer into chaos. The sky above the sea lit up with fire and smoke, the force of the blast sending ripples across the surface. The crew of U-123 watched, breathless, as the enemy ship writhed in the flames, sinking slowly into the dark, swallowed by the ocean's fury. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. But for the men of U-123, for just a moment, they had won. The storm was far from over, but they had weathered the worst of it. And as the last of the destroyer disappeared beneath the waves, Krieger knew one thing above all else. They had fought. They had fought like men, and they had survived. For now, the sea is a mirror of the soul. It reflects what is inside you, magnifying your fears and your desires. For the crew of U-123, the deep waters beneath the ocean's surface were no longer just a hiding place. They had become a prison, a place where time stretched endlessly, where every second of silence felt like a century, and where every thought was a weight on the heart. They had fought, and for a moment, they had won. But the fight wasn't over. The enemy was still out there, circling, waiting. The war was still happening above them. But down here, in the belly of the beast, there was nothing but the constant reminder that every breath they took was a victory, and every moment they spent in the deep was one they might not get back. U-123 had survived, but the victory had come at a steep cost. The damage to the boat was far worse than Krieger had anticipated. The hull groaned under the pressure, and there were strange, unsettling sounds echoing through the walls, sounds that spoke of metal bending and breaking under the immense weight of the ocean. The crew was exhausted. They had been submerged for days, the air inside the boat thick with sweat, fear, and the scent of oil and diesel. Krieger stood in the control room, his eyes fixed on the sonar screen. The destroyers had been destroyed, but the danger wasn't gone. They were still in the depths, still trapped between the unyielding weight of the ocean and the relentless pursuit of enemy forces. The thought of surfacing, of exposing themselves to the world above, was unbearable. "We've survived so far," Lehman said, his voice heavy with fatigue as he watched Krieger. "But for how much longer, Captain?" Krieger didn't respond at first. His eyes were locked on the sonar readout, trying to make sense of the strange pattern before him. The pinging was intermittent now, but it was there. The enemy had scattered, but they had not given up the hunt. They were out there, somewhere above, waiting for them to make a move. "I don't know," Krieger said finally, his voice hoarse. "But we're not done yet. Not until we have no other choice." The words hung between them, thick with the unspoken fear that gnawed at every man aboard U-123. How much longer could they stay submerged? The deeper they went, the greater the pressure, and the greater the chance that the boat would break apart. But the alternative, surfacing into the waiting guns of the enemy, was something none of them could bear to consider. The crew moved like ghosts through the dark halls of the submarine, tired eyes and heavy hearts marking every step. The engines hummed, but the sound felt far away, as though they were underwater, not inside a boat. The control room had become a place of quiet desperation, with each member of the crew bracing for the next order, the next move, the next possible chance of survival. Krieger stood by the periscope, watching the dark expanse of the ocean through its lens. There was nothing to see, just the black, empty sea stretching out endlessly in every direction. The enemy could be anywhere. They could be above, just waiting for them to surface, or they could be miles away, moving off, giving up the search for the moment. The uncertainty was maddening. "Captain," Lehman said, breaking the silence, "we need to make a decision. If we stay down here, we're not going to make it. The damage is too severe. We'll run out of oxygen. We'll run out of everything." Krieger turned, his face etched with the lines of exhaustion and decision. He knew Lehman was right. There were no good choices left. The sea was closing in on them, and every second they remained down here brought them closer to disaster. "Prepare for an emergency surfacing," Krieger said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "We'll get what we can fixed and take our chances on the surface." Lehman's eyes widened with disbelief. "Captain, you're sure? If we surface, we expose ourselves. The destroyers will be back on us in minutes." Krieger met his gaze. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment, Lehman. We're running out of time. We can either take a chance and try to repair what we can on the surface, or we stay down here and wait for the ocean to swallow us whole." Lehman hesitated, his face pale but resolute. "Aye, Captain." The crew went to work quickly, moving with the urgency of men who knew that life and death were a heartbeat apart. The torpedo rooms were checked, the ballast tanks adjusted, and the repair crews worked to stabilize the engine and fix the critical damage. The boat groaned beneath the weight of their repairs, and the walls seemed to tighten with every passing second. The deeper they went, the more the sea felt alive, like a great beast closing in on them. The men moved through the boat like shadows, their faces drawn and pale, each man carrying his own burden. Fear, doubt, exhaustion, These were the things that weighed them down now. The weight of their mission, the weight of their survival. Krieger stayed at the helm, his mind a maze of calculations. The ocean was their enemy. Yes, but there was something else too. Something that gnawed at him more than any destroyer or depth charge. It was the sense of inevitability. Every man aboard knew that the longer they stayed submerged, the greater the risk. The greater the risk that the ocean would take them. Muller, the sonar operator, looked up from his station, his face pale and tight. "Captain," he said, his voice shaky. "The destroyers, they're moving off. They're not circling anymore. They're leaving." Krieger's heart gave a quiet thud in his chest. Was this it? Had they finally given up? Or was this just another trick? The uncertainty was maddening. "Do we have any confirmation?" Krieger asked, his voice calm but edged with a quiet desperation. Muller shook his head. "Not yet, sir. I just lost the signal for a moment. It could be temporary." Krieger nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll hold our course. Prepare to surface in 5 minutes. Get ready to make repairs as soon as we're on the surface." The boat rose slowly, creeping toward the surface of the ocean like a wounded animal. The men moved quickly, adjusting the valves and mechanisms that would allow them to breach the surface. The world outside remained silent, an unknown expanse waiting for them to make the first move. Minutes passed, stretching into hours. The boat creaked and groaned, the pressure building as they neared the surface. The feeling of uncertainty, of dread, grew thicker, and then, as if summoned by their tension, a single, unexpected sound broke the silence. The sonar pinged, once, then twice, then 3 times. "Captain," Muller said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're back. The destroyers are coming." The words hit like a blow to the gut. U-123 was no longer the predator. It was the prey, and the hunters were closing in. Krieger's hands tightened around the controls. "Full speed ahead," he ordered. "We're not waiting any longer." The boat surged toward the surface. The men scrambled to get into position, to make final adjustments. The world outside felt like it was closing in, the weight of the ocean pressing down on them, the pressure of the destroyers above closing in like a trap. "Brace for impact," Layman shouted as the boat broke through the surface, bursting into the cold, biting air. The ocean exploded around them as U-123 rose from the depths, a whale surfacing from the darkness. The world above was a different place. The sky was gray, the wind cold. But the real enemy was not the weather. It was the destroyers, just visible on the horizon, their guns trained on them. Krieger's heart raced as he scanned the horizon. There was no more room for hesitation. They had no choice but to fight. "Fire the first torpedo," he ordered, his voice calm but edged with a quiet intensity. The first torpedo shot out, disappearing into the ocean with a hiss. The destroyer on the left erupted in a burst of flame, the shockwave rattling U-123. But there was no time to celebrate. The second destroyer was closing in, its guns opening fire. Krieger gripped the controls, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Keep firing. Don't stop until we've taken them both down." For the men of U-123, it was no longer about survival. It was about defiance, about showing the world that they would not be defeated, not without a fight. The ocean, in its vast and indifferent majesty, had always been both a sanctuary and a prison for the men of U-123. For weeks, they had lived beneath its unforgiving surface, hidden from the world above, but always aware that the deep waters could turn on them at any moment. The threat had been looming, close, relentless. The destroyers were still out there, circling the depths like sharks drawn to blood. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a fleeting moment of calm. A moment where the sea was their ally, offering a fragile respite from the constant pressure from the hunt. For the crew, it was a moment they knew wouldn't last. The silence between sonar pings felt like an omen. The world above had seen them surface. The surface was no longer a sanctuary. The decision to fight, to face the destroyers head-on, was not one they had made lightly. But there was no going back now. They were in the storm's eye, the calm before everything broke apart. Inside U-123, the air was still thick, a mixture of diesel, oil, sweat, and fear. The sounds of the ocean outside were muffled, a low hum through the steel walls, but the crew could feel the weight of the sea pressing on them from all sides. Even though they were afloat, they knew the enemy was circling, waiting for them to make a wrong move. They had done what they could. Now it was about survival. Krieger stood at the helm, staring out into the empty expanse of ocean. He could see nothing but the gray horizon, broken only by the faint outline of the destroyers on the horizon. His mind was sharp, his gaze cold, but his heart? His heart was heavy with the weight of what they had done and what still lay ahead. He had taken the fight to the surface, and now they were in it, exposed. If the torpedoes hadn't struck true, if their aim hadn't been precise enough, they'd be at the mercy of the enemy's guns. Lehman approached, his face as grim as Krieger's. "Captain, we're exposed. The destroyers are getting closer. We need to move. Now." Krieger's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer immediately. He was calculating the risk in his mind. The surface had offered them a brief advantage, but now it was a double-edged sword. If they moved too fast, they risked revealing their position even more. If they stayed in place, the destroyers would close in on them and unleash everything they had. There was no perfect choice, only the desperate reality of war. "How much longer?" Krieger asked. Lehman's face was a mask of exhaustion, his eyes shadowed from days of sleeplessness. 10 minutes. 20 maybe. The destroyers are closing in faster than we thought. Krieger nodded, his mind working through the decision. "Ready the crew. We'll stay low for as long as we can. Once we've made our move, there's no turning back." Lehman didn't argue. He turned, gathering the crew, giving them the same order they had followed 100 times before. Prepare for battle. Prepare to fight, to survive. The crew moved with quiet urgency. The men worked at their stations, hands steady despite the pressure, despite the fear that threatened to choke them. There was no time for second-guessing, no room for doubt. They had come this far, and they weren't going to let the ocean swallow them whole without a fight. They would take the fight to the destroyers, or they would die trying. Down in the torpedo room, the air was thick with tension. Every man knew what they were about to do. They were about to unleash the fury of the U-boat on an enemy that had been relentless, that had been chasing them from the moment they left port. The torpedo crews worked with practiced precision, loading the tubes, adjusting the settings. The sound of metal clanking against metal was a grim symphony, one that echoed through the boat, reminding everyone of what they were preparing for. Muller, the sonar operator, was the first to speak. His voice was tight, his words strained with the weight of his fear. "Captain, they're closer. The lead destroyer is almost within range. They've got their guns trained on us." Krieger's eyes never wavered from the horizon. "How long?" Muller swallowed, his fingers dancing across the sonar panel. "We have less than 5 minutes. If we don't make our move now." Krieger didn't need to hear the rest. He knew what was at stake. He knew what the men of U-123 were about to face. The destroyers were closing in, and the only way to survive was to hit them first, to strike before they could open fire. "Ready the first torpedo," Krieger ordered, his voice low but firm. "Fire when you're ready." There was a moment of silence. The tension inside U-123 felt like it could tear the boat apart. The crew was waiting, holding their breath, ready to unleash everything they had. They had no other choice. The time had come. Muller's voice broke through the stillness. "Torpedo 1, ready, Captain." Krieger nodded. "Fire." The first torpedo shot forward with a sharp hiss, cutting through the water like a harbinger of death. The crew watched with bated breath, waiting for the impact. Seconds felt like hours. And then, an explosion. A burst of fire and smoke lit up the dark waters ahead. The destroyer rocked violently, its hull shuddering under the force of the blast. The crew of U-123 held their breath, hoping against hope that they had struck true. But there was no time to savor the moment. The second destroyer was still out there, still bearing down on them. Krieger turned to Lehman. "Get the second torpedo ready. We can't afford to waste any time." Lehman moved swiftly, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue. The men in the torpedo room worked quickly, their hands moving in sync, loading the next torpedo into the tube. The crew had become a well-oiled machine, their fear drowned by the singular focus of survival. Seconds later, Muller's voice came through again, low and tense. "Torpedo 2 ready. Fire." The second torpedo shot out with deadly precision, leaving behind a trail of bubbles as it sped toward the second destroyer. The world held its breath. Another explosion rocked the sea, this one even more violent than the first. The second destroyer erupted in a ball of fire, the blast sending shockwaves through the water. It was a moment of triumph, a moment where the crew of U-123 could finally exhale, even if just for a second. But as the smoke cleared, The crew knew there was no time to celebrate. The battle wasn't over. The enemy wasn't done. The third destroyer had been circling, waiting for its moment, and it wasn't going to let U-123 slip away so easily. The destroyer wasn't far off now. They could see it, a shadow in the distance, its guns trained on them. The crew braced themselves for what was coming. There was no way to outrun it now. Krieger's eyes were fixed on the ship. "Get us below. Dive deep." Lehman's face tightened. "Captain, we're already at full depth. We can't go any deeper without risking collapse." Krieger didn't respond. He had no answers. There were no more options left. They could only pray that their torpedoes had done enough damage, that the destroyers would be too crippled to continue the fight. But there was no way to know for sure. The ocean was closing in on them. The third destroyer opened fire. The guns thundered, sending shells crashing into the water around them. U-123 shuddered under the impact, the sound of the shells slamming into the sea like distant thunder. The boat groaned in protest, but it held firm. They had made it this far. They couldn't stop now. "Hold steady," Krieger commanded. "We need one more shot. Just one more." Lehman nodded, and the crew scrambled to prepare the final torpedo. The men's hands were shaking, but their resolve was ironclad. They had faced death at every turn, and they weren't about to give up now. The final torpedo was loaded, aimed, and ready. Muller's voice rang through the control room, quiet but full of certainty. "Torpedo 3, ready, Captain." Krieger took a breath. His mind cleared despite the storm inside. "Fire!" The final torpedo shot forward. The world seemed to hold its breath as the metal missile cut through the water. The crew could feel the tension, could feel the fate of their survival resting on that final shot. And then, an explosion. Another one. The final destroyer erupted in flames, its hull shattered by the force of the blast. The shockwaves rattled U-123, but it was a victory, a hard-won victory. The last destroyer had been neutralized. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the crew of U-123 let out a collective breath. The destroyers were gone. The battle was over. But in the depths of the ocean, there was no true peace. The crew knew this victory, hard as it was fleeting. They were still in. There are moments in every war where the sound of the battle fades away, replaced by the quiet that comes with the realization that you have survived. It's a brief, fragile pause, a moment where everything slows, and you are left with nothing but the cold certainty of what you've faced and what's still ahead. For the men of U-123, that moment had come. The destroyers were gone. The sea was still. The world above was once again silent. But beneath the waves, the silence held a different meaning. It was the calm before another storm. The crew of U-123 had fought their way through the worst, but even in victory, there was no true respite. The battle had taken its toll. The men were exhausted, their bodies and minds worn thin. For days, they had been submerged, trapped between the crushing pressure of the ocean and the relentless pursuit of the enemy. Now, with the destroyers destroyed, they had a brief window of peace, but it felt like a dream, one that could shatter at any moment. Inside the submarine, the air was thick with a quiet that had settled over them all. The usual sounds of the boat, the hum of the engines, the creaks of metal, had dimmed, replaced by the soft whispers of men trying to find rest in the midst of war. But rest didn't come easy. Not when you were this deep in the ocean. Not when you knew that the world above could swallow you whole at any moment. Krieger sat in the control room, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the console. His face was drawn, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his features. His eyes, though, were sharp, still vigilant. There was no peace for him. Not yet. Lehman entered quietly, his footsteps soft against the steel floor. The first officer had the same tired look as the rest of the crew, his face pale and weary. "We've made it this far," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But what now, Captain?" Krieger didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, but it was racing through the same unanswerable questions. They had destroyed the destroyers. They had survived the worst of it, but they were still trapped in the deep. The boat was badly damaged. The sea was their prison now. Even if they had won the battle, the war wasn't over. "We wait," Krieger said finally, his voice firm but tinged with something else. "We wait for the sea to give us a chance." Lehman nodded, though it was clear that neither of them believed the words. Waiting was never a comfort. Waiting meant time slipping away, and in war, time was the one thing you could never get back. Hours passed, each one slipping by like a grain of sand in an hourglass. The boat remained submerged, drifting deeper into the ocean. The men went about their tasks, their motions automatic, but the tension never left. They were survivors now, but survivors of what? A battle won. Yes, but at what cost? Muller, the sonar operator, hadn't moved from his station for what felt like days. His eyes were fixed on the sonar screen, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that the enemy might return. The silence was unbearable, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Krieger moved through the boat, checking in with his men, his eyes lingering on each face he passed. There was no time for real rest. Even if the immediate danger had passed, the ocean was a different kind of threat, one that couldn't be seen, only felt. The weight of the water outside, the pressure that could crush them at any moment, was always there, always present. The damage to U-123 had been severe. The depth charges, the torpedo impacts, they had all left their mark. But the boat still floated. It still moved, though not as smoothly as it had before. The engines were sluggish. The pressure hull had been weakened. Every groan and creak of the boat was a reminder of how close they had come to destruction. And then there were the men. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally. They had been pushed to the brink, and now, with no clear end in sight, they were left to deal with the quiet aftermath. For most, that quiet was the hardest part. The anticipation of the next attack, the tension that had carried them through the battle, had been replaced by something far more insidious, the creeping dread of uncertainty. Krieger stopped by the torpedo room, where the crew was still working, checking the systems. The men were quiet, moving with slow, deliberate movements, their faces weary but determined. They knew that their role wasn't over. Even if the destroyers were gone, there were still enemies lurking, other dangers, other threats that the sea could bring. Lehman joined him a few moments later, his brow furrowed. "We can't stay down here forever, Captain," he said, the words heavy with the weight of truth. "The boat's not going to last." "I know," Krieger replied, his voice rough. "But what choice do we have?" Lehman's eyes flickered to the crew, to the tired, silent faces of the men working below deck. "We can try to surface, make repairs, get back to base. But if we do, there's a chance the enemy could pick us up. We'd be sitting ducks." Krieger nodded slowly. He knew. He had known from the moment they surfaced to face the destroyers that their window of safety was incredibly small. And now, with the boat battered and their supplies dwindling, the choice was a grim one. Stay hidden, submerged, and risk the collapse of the hull, or surface and take their chances above, where the enemy would be waiting. "We'll wait a little longer," Krieger said finally. "The longer we stay down here, the less chance we have of being detected. We'll take our chances with the boat." Lehman nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his face. "Aye, Captain." The silence stretched on. It was a silence that gnawed at their insides, that made every small sound, every groan of the boat, every shuffle of footsteps, seem louder than it should have been. There was no escape from it. No escaping the fact that they were trapped, that the ocean, in all its vastness, was both their protector and their enemy. Muller's voice broke the quiet, sharp and filled with anxiety. "Captain, there's movement. I'm picking up something on the sonar." Krieger's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of movement?" Muller didn't answer immediately, his eyes glued to the sonar screen. "It's not a destroyer. It's too fast, but it's big. A ship. I'm not sure." Krieger moved quickly to the sonar station, his mind racing. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the tense pause before the world erupted into chaos again. "Can you get a visual on it?" Krieger asked, his voice tight. Muller shook his head. "It's moving too quickly, and the sonar is picking up interference. It's hard to tell exactly what it is." Krieger's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The destroyers were gone. But now, something else was moving in the water, something large. The question was, what? And more importantly, was it friend or foe? "Raise the periscope," Krieger ordered. Lehman was already moving to do just that, his face tight with concentration. He turned the crank slowly, the familiar motion of the periscope rising from the depths of the boat. The men watched in silence, their eyes fixed on the glass as it broke the surface. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, through the scope, a shadow passed. Krieger's breath caught in his chest. It was a ship, too big to be a destroyer, too fast to be anything they had seen before. "Get me a visual. Now," Krieger barked. The crew scrambled to adjust the lenses, to focus on the strange ship as it moved through the waters. What was it? And why was it here? Krieger's mind was a storm of possibilities. A new threat? A rescue? A trap? But as the ship drew closer, its silhouette becoming clearer through the periscope, he saw the insignia on its hull. It wasn't the enemy. It was German. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. It was a rescue ship, a U-boat tender, sent to pick up survivors from damaged boats. The relief that washed over Krieger was so profound it almost knocked him off his feet. He had no idea how long they had been waiting, how long they had fought for survival. But now, finally, it seemed that the ocean had returned them to the world above. "Signal them," Krieger ordered, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. Lehman moved quickly, sending out a distress signal. The crew waited in silence, hearts racing. The chance of rescue was real. They had made it. The ocean had been their battleground, their sanctuary, their prison. For weeks, U-123 had drifted through its dark depths, fighting to survive, fighting to escape, fighting simply to be. Now, as the crew stood on the threshold of salvation, there was a weight in the air, a sense of disbelief, as if the very sea itself was reluctant to let them go. The U-boat tender had arrived. The long-awaited signal had come through, the distant promise of rescue finally a reality. But as Krieger watched the ship draw nearer, a sense of unease settled in his chest. They had fought so hard to reach this moment, to survive against impossible odds. And now, with the end in sight, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean had one last test for them. The U-boat tender, a hulking vessel designed to carry supplies and personnel to damaged submarines, appeared to be a lifeline. But lifelines could break, too. The thought hung in the air, palpable and heavy, even as the crew began to stir with a quiet, cautious hope. They had seen too much, lost too much, to trust in anything too easily. But Krieger, ever the captain, knew that if they didn't seize this opportunity, the alternative was unthinkable. The men of U-123 had fought their way through hell to reach this moment. The battles against the destroyers, the near-collapsing hull, the crushing isolation, all of it had brought them to this final, fragile chance. Yet, as the U-boat tender closed the gap, it wasn't just relief they felt. It was the quiet realization that survival came at a price. They had given so much already. What would be left when it was finally over? Krieger stood at the helm, his hand resting lightly on the wheel, as if he was still holding the ship's fate in his grasp. He knew, deep down, that the ocean would never truly release them. Not fully. There was too much of it in them now. The cold, the isolation, the fear. It had left scars on each of them, some visible, others buried deep. The men moved about the boat with a new energy, but it wasn't the kind of joy that comes with victory. It was the quiet relief of exhaustion, of knowing that the end of their journey was near. But it was also tinged with something else, a bitter awareness that this was not a triumphant escape. They had made it, yes, but they had made it at great cost. And now, the question was no longer how they would survive the war. It was whether they could survive the aftermath. The U-boat tender came alongside, its crew ready to assist. Krieger had no illusions about what this would mean. The boat's damage was severe. The men were barely able to stand, let alone face the next challenge. They would have to be taken aboard the tender, where they would be evaluated, patched up, and sent back to the war, whether they were ready or not. Krieger stepped toward the control panel, his face set in grim determination. "Prepare to be boarded. I'll go first." Lehman stepped forward, his voice strained with exhaustion. "Are you sure, Captain? We've made it this far. Maybe it's time we all rest." Krieger turned, his eyes meeting Lehman's with a cold, resolute gaze. "Rest is a luxury we haven't earned yet. The war is still out there, and we've been given another chance." Lehman nodded, his lips tight. He knew better than to argue. There was no time for rest. Not yet. As the men of U-123 prepared to leave their boat behind, they felt the weight of what they had been through. The battles, the fears, the sacrifices. Every man had his own story to tell, his own personal hell to remember. But together, they had made it through. They had survived not just the enemy, but the ocean itself. Krieger stepped onto the deck of the U-boat tender, his boots creaking against the metal, the familiar sensation of solid ground beneath him a strange relief. But there was no joy in the moment. Not yet. There was only the bitter taste of survival, the harsh knowledge that they had come so close to death, and were now given a second chance, only to return to the war that had nearly taken everything from them. The crew of the tender greeted them with a mixture of surprise and somber recognition. There was no cheer, no celebration, just the cold, quiet acknowledgement of what they had been through. The men of U-123 were different now. They were no longer just soldiers. They were survivors, haunted by what they had seen and what they had lost. Krieger stood at the bow of the tender, watching the U-boat slowly sink into the depths, the fading silhouette of U-123 swallowed by the ocean. It was a strange, final farewell, a boat that had been their home, their prison, and their weapon. And now, it was nothing more than a wreck, a testament to the struggle they had endured. The men aboard the tender went to work, moving quickly to assess the damage, to tend to the wounded. They were efficient, but there was no rush. There was no need. They knew what had happened, and they knew what would come next. The war wasn't over. It was just one more step forward, one more part of the journey. But for the men of U-123, there was no escaping the past. It clung to them. The memories of the battles, the quiet moments of terror, the days spent in the deep, the men they had lost. Even now, as they moved toward safety, the weight of it all was still there, heavy and real. Krieger stood in the corner of the deck, his hands clasped behind his back. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed him, haunted by the images of the past. The sea had given them another chance, but it had taken so much from them already. How could they ever truly leave it behind? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Layman stood beside him, his expression one of quiet understanding. "You did what needed to be done, Captain. You kept us alive." Krieger didn't answer right away. He was staring out at the endless expanse of water, the ocean stretching before them like an eternal abyss. It was hard to escape, hard to move on, but he had to. They all had to. "We all did," Krieger replied finally. "But we'll never be the same again." Layman said nothing. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The men of U-123 had been to the very edge of existence and had returned, only to face another battle, one that would be fought in their hearts and minds. They had survived the war, but could they survive the memories? The hours passed slowly as the U-boat tender made its way toward a safer port. The men were quiet, each lost in their thoughts, each wrestling with the price of survival. What had it cost them? What had they lost along the way? When they finally arrived at the port, it was a different world waiting for them. The war was still out there, still raging, but for a moment, there was peace. The warships and soldiers milling about the docks seemed like ghosts of a different time. And yet, it was the same world, the same battle, the same men, now forever changed. The crew of U-123 disembarked, their feet on solid ground, their hearts heavy with what they had lost and what they had gained. They had survived, yes, but survival had its own scars. The war wasn't over for them, not yet. As Krieger stepped off the tender and onto the shore, he looked back at the sea one last time. It was still there, waiting. The ocean had been both their salvation and their curse. It had taken so much from them, and yet it had given them this last chance. But the question lingered, hanging in the air like the fog rolling off the water. Could they ever truly escape its depths?
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more great content.